The girl who heard heaven. Her name was Joan. She was born in a small French village called Domremy. It was the year 1425, and the sun that morning was hiding behind a sheet of mist, like a secret refusing to be told. A rooster crowed lazily in the distance, its voice swallowed by the thick fog. Joan was kneeling alone at the edge of a field, where the earth was still soft from yesterday's rain. She wasn't farming or playing. She was just there, looking up at the sky like it might fall. She was thinking about war. France was at war again. It felt like the world had always been split in two, half in pain, half pretending not to feel it. She had seen men with missing limbs. Women who whispered instead of speaking. A boy who screamed in his sleep and woke up crying without knowing why. The grown-ups said it was normal. Joan didn't think so. She thought heaven must have slipped and cracked the earth. She kept staring at the clouds. Not to ask why, but to ask, when would heaven fix it? No one ever taught her what it meant to be brave. Her family was poor. They had sheep to tend and bread to bake. Her father feared taxes more than soldiers. Her mother prayed a lot and told stories of saints who bled for good causes. Joan always listened, but she didn't believe she'd ever be one of them. Her hands were made for carrying buckets, not swords. Yet that day in the field, something changed. Her body didn't shake, but her soul did, like a bell rung by a hand you couldn't see. In the quiet between the wind, Joan began to hear something that wasn't there. It wasn't the chirping of birds or the rustling of trees. It was something clearer. Like music wrapped in thunder. She didn't flinch. She felt warmth in her bones, soft but wild, like fire with manners. Her breath slowed. Her eyes blinked fast. She didn't understand it. But it didn't scare her. That was the strange part. Some fear runs away from you. Some walks beside you, pretending to be purpose. The voices kept coming. Not once, not twice, but over and over until she couldn't tell which thoughts were hers and which ones were not. They told her that France was broken. That God still loved it. That she, a peasant girl who couldn't even read, would help fix what armies could not. She stood up from the field with knees covered in mud and heart covered in lightning. And still, nobody knew what she had just heard. The cows kept chewing. The sky remained silent. And far away, drums of war echoed. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sounds were louder now, not in her ears, but in her chest. Her mother hummed a hymn while fixing a torn garment by the fire. Her father sharpened a farming blade. Her brothers argued over a stick. Everything looked normal. But Joan knew what normal felt like, and this was not it. She felt like the air had teeth. Like something invisible was walking through their small home with bare feet, watching her. She started spending more time alone, listening. Not because she wanted to run from the world, but because she had started to hear the whispers of another one. The village priest told her not to worry. He said that sometimes God gives people dreams. Joan nodded, but this wasn't a dream. It was a demand. A call too heavy for her small body. But her soul had grown wider than her years, and it kept pushing her forward. By the age of 13, she was no longer just a farm girl. She was someone else. Not yet a soldier. Not yet a saint. But something between lightning and wood. Her body was the same, but her steps had changed. She walked like a candle trying not to burn out. The voices now told her to go find Charles, the prince without a crown, and help him reclaim France. She didn't even know where Charles was. She didn't know what a court looked like. She didn't know how to hold a sword. Still, the order was clear. Her village thought she had gone mad. Some pitied her. Others feared her. She didn't blame them. If she had heard another girl say angels told her to go to war, she might have laughed too. But Joan wasn't laughing. She was packing. A small bag. A piece of bread. A piece of courage. And something deeper than hope. Something that felt like it had teeth and claws and wings. She didn't tell her mother goodbye with words. She just squeezed her hand a little too long. Her father didn't look up from his work. Maybe he didn't want to see her go. Or maybe he didn't believe she really would. But she did. She left Domremy on foot, with dust on her shoes and thunder in her chest. Behind her, the fields looked calm. Ahead, the world looked like a storm. She walked into it anyway. The first town she reached was filled with rumors. England was winning. France was bleeding. People said the Crown Prince was a coward, hiding behind walls while soldiers died. Some blamed the devil. Others blamed the king. Nobody blamed a girl. Because nobody thought a girl mattered. Joan kept her eyes low. She listened. She watched. She learned. People spoke of Orleans, a city under siege, choking on smoke and fear. The voices told her Orleans would be her proving ground. To reach the Crown Prince, Joan needed help. But no soldier wanted to escort a barefoot girl who claimed to speak with angels. They mocked her. Laughed at her. One even threw a pebble at her and called her a witch. But Joan never stopped walking. Rejection felt like rain, annoying. The gates of Orleans groaned open like the jaws of a wounded beast. Inside, it smelled of ash and rot, and the buildings leaned like exhausted soldiers. Fires still burned in corners, not from battle, but from despair. Joan's white horse stepped into the city like a ghost wandering into a nightmare. She didn't wave to the crowds. She didn't smile. She just kept riding, banner in hand, eyes sharp. Her heart beat like a war drum. Her skin crawled with something she couldn't name. The city was choking, and she had come to force it to breathe. The soldiers who followed her were unsure. Their eyes flicked from her armor to the broken homes around them. They had seen war. But they had never followed a girl. Joan didn't care for their doubts. She had her instructions. Not from men, but from a place beyond clouds and kings. The voices told her where to strike. Which bridges to watch. Which towers to ignore. She spoke like a commander, even though she had never studied battle. Her knowledge came from somewhere deeper than books. It came from stillness. From faith. From fire. At first, the generals resisted. They grumbled behind closed doors. They called her lucky, then arrogant. But her plans worked. One by one, French strongholds were recaptured. Her instincts, wild as they seemed, proved sharper than any map. When she said, "No," they moved, and victory followed. It wasn't easy. The English fought like beasts. Arrows flew like rain. Cannons boomed with hunger. But Joan stood tall, her banner always visible, like a lighthouse for lost hearts. Even when wounded, pierced by a longbow in her shoulder, she returned to the fight before the blood dried. Joan's courage was not loud. It was not the kind that shouted or showed teeth. It was quiet and stubborn. It crept into people's bones without permission. One by one, her soldiers began to believe. Not just in the war, but in her. She was more than a commander. She was a mirror. When they looked at her, they saw the version of themselves that didn't tremble. That didn't run. That didn't need to be reminded what France was worth. She never killed. Not with her own hands. Her sword stayed clean. But her spirit cut deeper than steel. She told the men to confess their sins. She demanded they stop swearing and stealing. Some laughed. But most listened. Because in the darkest hours of battle, when the smoke thickened and screams echoed through the air, she stood taller than flames. Even when the English called her a devil, she didn't flinch. She had been called worse. By doubt. By fear. By silence. Victory came like rain after drought. The siege of Orleans broke. The English fled like shadows at dawn. The city erupted with cheers. Bells rang. Flags waved. But Joan didn't celebrate. She looked beyond the walls, toward the horizon. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only a beginning. France was still cracked. Charles still wore no crown. And the voices had not yet gone quiet. Her path was not done. The people began to call her the Maid of Orleans. Songs were written. Crowds followed her wherever she rode. Some tried to touch her hand, thinking it might bring them miracles. But Joan stayed distant. Not because she was proud, but because she had seen what fame did to men. It swallowed them. And she still needed her soul to be light, clear enough to hear heaven. So she remained small inside, even as her legend grew louder. Charles, the uncrowned prince, was still hesitating. He feared betrayal. He feared failure. He feared the crown that was rightfully his. Joan pressed him. She reminded him who he was. She urged him to go to Reims, the city where kings were crowned. He delayed. He listened to advisers who whispered poison in his ear. But Joan didn't stop pushing. Her voice never cracked. Her presence never dimmed. She became his compass when his will spun like a leaf in the wind. Finally, he agreed. The journey to Reims was dangerous. Enemy territory stood between them and destiny. But Joan led the way, cutting through doubt like a blade. Villages welcomed her with flowers and prayers. Even towns that feared France now opened their gates, moved by her spirit. When they reached Reims, the impossible happened. The city surrendered without a fight. Charles was crowned king, wrapped in gold and glory. But behind him stood Joan, armor dusted with travel, her eyes filled with something deeper than pride. She had done what armies couldn't. She had taken a broken nation and stitched it back together with faith and fire. Yet even then, she knew the story wasn't over. The voices grew quieter. Not gone. Just watchful. She began to feel like a candle burning at both ends. Her dreams were heavier now. Her steps slower. Something was shifting. She had seen too many dead. Too many widows. Too many orphans who didn't know how to cry anymore. Still, she marched on. More battles. More cities. But not all victories. Some defeats came like whispers, others like thunder. Joan began to sense that not everyone wanted her to succeed. Some in Charles's court envied her power. Others feared it. She was a peasant girl who had become a saint in the eyes of the people, and that made her dangerous. The same hands that once lifted her in celebration now tightened behind her back. One night, while preparing for a siege, Joan was betrayed. She had gone to defend the town of Compiègne from an attack. But when the drawbridge rose behind her, she realized she had been trapped. Her men were inside. She was outside. Surrounded. The English captured her. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked up at the sky, and her lips moved like a prayer written in silence. They took her to Burgundy first, then sold her to the English. She was paraded through towns like a prize. The same girl who had once led armies now stood in chains. Her armor was replaced with rags. Her voice, once filled with thunder, was now questioned, mocked, and picked apart. They said she was a witch. That her visions were lies. That her faith was rebellion. Joan didn't break. But cracks appeared, fine, hairline fractures across the face of someone who had stared too long into fire. The trial was worse than any battlefield. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. Her judges wanted to silence her spirit. To unwrite her story. They accused her of heresy for wearing men's clothes. For hearing voices. For leading men. They twisted her words. Trapped her with questions. Every answer she gave was used against her. Yet Joan held her ground, not with anger, but with a stillness that made even liars feel exposed. In the dark of her prison cell, she heard no voices. Heaven had grown quiet. But her heart still burned. She knew the end was near. She was 19. Too young to die. But too wise to be afraid of it. She had lived more in those years than most lived in a lifetime. Her life had been a storm. But storms don't apologize for lightning. They light the sky and then disappear. When they sentenced her to death, she didn't cry. She asked for a cross. Not to wear, but to hold. And she asked that someone hold it high enough that she could see it through the smoke. The sky above Rouen was unusually quiet that morning. Not even the birds dared to sing. Smoke from bakeries mingled with mist, curling through narrow alleys like whispers looking for ears. In the middle of the town square, they were building something, a wooden scaffold with rough edges and sharp angles. People gathered slowly, drawn by rumor, by duty, by curiosity. Most didn't speak. Some didn't blink. The smell of wet wood and sweat filled the air. You could taste tension on your tongue like spoiled bread. Joan stood in her cell, barefoot and pale. Her skin was marked by months of chains. Her spirit wore no bruises. They had shaved her head. They had taken her sword, her horse, her banner. But they couldn't take her flame. That was inside. Deeper than bone. She looked at the tiny crack in the wall, and imagined it was a path. A crack wide enough to slip a prayer through. Her fingers were cold, but her heart still burned. Not with anger, but with clarity. She knew why this was happening. And she had made peace with it. Outside, the crowd shifted. Some came to see justice. Some to see a witch. Some came hoping for a miracle. And some came simply because they didn't want to miss history. But no one, not even the judges, truly understood the story they were witnessing. They thought they were burning a body. But they were planting something else, something the fire would fail to kill. Truth does not burn. It waits in the ash. Joan walked to the square under heavy guard. Her steps were small but sure. The sound of her chains scraping the cobblestones echoed louder than the murmurs around her. Some people looked away. Some stared too long. Her face was not afraid. It was peaceful, but not empty. Like someone who had read the last page of her book and finally understood the beginning. They tied her to the post. They piled the wood. The rope scratched her skin. The smoke made her cough. But still, she looked up, not to the crowd, but to the sky. A priest stood nearby, holding a cross high. She fixed her gaze on it as the fire was lit. Flames started low, licking the wood like dogs testing a stranger. Then they roared, hungry and impatient. The heat rose. The wind shifted. Some people turned their faces away. Some cried. Some cursed. The fire danced around her like a wild thing trying to understand its target. And as the smoke thickened and swallowed her shape, a strange silence fell. No scream. No plea. Just the crackle of burning wood, and a stillness that made the heavens lean in. Joan's body turned to ash, but her fire did not go out. It scattered, into the lungs of witnesses, into the breath of a broken king, into the soil of France. Her voice stopped, but her silence grew louder. Within a generation, the church that condemned her would call her a saint. The same men who had called her a witch would rewrite her name in gold. But she never needed their approval. Her crown was never made of metal. It was made of mission. What Joan of Arc left behind was not just a story of war. It was a story of purpose. A girl with no army, no title, no education, changed the fate of a nation. Not with magic. Not with madness. But with faith that refused to whisper. She proved that courage doesn't come from power. It comes from conviction. She didn't just hear voices, she answered them. Even when it cost her everything. In time, her ashes blew across battlefields she once walked. And those who once doubted began to believe. Generations told her story. Artists painted her flame. Writers carved her name in the spines of books. Soldiers wore her symbol. Mothers named daughters after her. And somewhere, in the silence between history and heaven, a voice still speaks. It's not loud. But it is clear. Stand. Joan of Arc's life is more than a memory. It's a mirror. It asks hard questions. Would you risk everything for what you believe? Would you face the world with nothing but fire inside you? Would you still walk forward, if you knew the end was a stake and a flame? She taught us that obedience to conscience is sometimes rebellion to comfort. That the smallest voices, if faithful, can shatter the noise of nations. She reminded the world that purpose is not always safe. But it is always sacred. And though her feet no longer touch the earth, her fire still walks. In every quiet girl who dares to speak. In every frightened soul that chooses action. In every dream that shakes the spine before it lifts the head. Joan's legacy is not the fire that killed her. It's the truth that refused to die with her. Moral lessons from Joan of Arc's life and ministry. 1. Courage is not loud, it is consistent. Joan's bravery was not in shouting but in showing up, again and again, despite fear. 2. Faith can move more than mountains, it can move nations. Her belief didn't just sustain her. It guided kings, armies, and ordinary people. 3. Obedience to a higher voice will always be misunderstood by smaller minds. Joan was ridiculed, rejected, and burned, not for her weakness, but for her clarity. 4. Purity of purpose will face the fire, but fire only refines gold. She died young. But her influence lived far beyond the century that took her. 5. You don't need power to be powerful. Joan had no army, no royal blood. Just a vision, and the will to walk into it. 6. Even silence can speak. Joan's refusal to scream at the stake didn't make her weak. It made the fire feel small. 7. When truth walks into a courtroom, lies panic. Her trial was a warning to those who try to trap light in cages. 8. Martyrdom is not the end. It's the beginning of something louder. Her death was not a silence, it was an ignition. 9. Purpose has a cost. But Joan proved it's a price worth paying. 10. Every time you choose what is right over what is easy, you walk with Joan.